When talking about military decision-making in the various German operations of World War II, Hitler's interference in all of them is always analyzed. As is known by all, Hitler's power within the German army gradually increased throughout the entire conflict until it became omnipresent. Today in this program, we are going to analyze how and why Hitler took total control of the army and to what extent his generals deceived him or not. When Hitler took power at the beginning of 1933, most of the high-ranking officers of the army did not have special sympathy for him. In other programs, we could see Keitel's own opinion, which was shared by many of his colleagues, which did not leave Hitler in a very good light. Basically, they considered him a populist at a political level and a corporal at a military level. In addition, there was another concern within the German army, which was that of being replaced by the SA as the official army of the Reich. After finishing off the main leaders of the SA and thus ending this internal dispute, Hitler gained the trust of the high command of the German army. From this point on, they began to see him as someone who was going to rebuild and make the German army great again. Obviously, this is what they wanted, so he began to gain their sympathy. In August 1934, the Hitlerian oath was established for all soldiers in the army who no longer swore loyalty to Germany, but to the person of Hitler himself. This oath reads as follows: "I swear by God this sacred oath, that I owe unconditional obedience to the leader of the German Empire and people, Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht, and that, as a brave soldier, I will be prepared at all times to defend this oath with my life." From this point on, diplomatic and military victories began to occur in an unstoppable manner. In 1936, the Rhineland was remilitarized. In 1938, Austria was annexed, and at the beginning of 1939, Czechoslovakia fell. All these events, carried out without firing a shot, made Hitler gain more and more prestige in the eyes of everyone. When he gave the order to prepare an armed campaign against Poland, many alarms went off within the German high command because, contrary to what is usually thought, the German army was not prepared in 1939 for a large-scale armed conflict. The forecasts that had been set in their military production plans indicated that they would not be completely ready until at least 1945 or 1946. After the triumphant campaign against Poland, Hitler gave the order to prepare to attack France as soon as possible. Let us remember that at this time, Germany was at war with France and Great Britain, following the declaration of war by the Allies in early September in an attempt to defend Poland. It was here that all the alarm bells went off within the German high command, who saw this action as sheer madness. Defeating a poor country like Poland had been easy, even more so with Soviet support and the excellent German starting points that had allowed them to attack the Polish rearguard. But launching an attack against France, Holland, and Belgium, to which part of the British Army was also added, was a big deal. As if that were not enough, it seemed that in this campaign they had no other option than to carry out a frontal attack, either against the Maginot Line or against Belgium, which would almost certainly be bogged down. As a final touch, they had danger in their rear, since it was speculated that the Soviets would launch an attack against them as soon as the Western Front became bogged down. What we are going to see next is one of the main elements that would catapult Hitler towards absolute authority within the German army. Everything had to do with the plan that was finally chosen to attack France. Halder, Chief of General Staff of the Army High Command at that time, had planned everything to attack through Belgium, in an operation very similar to that of the First World War. The plan proposed by Manstein to cross the Ardennes and surround most of the Allied armies had been ignored. When Hitler happens to meet Manstein in person, and Manstein tells him his plan, Hitler takes over Manstein's plan and imposes it on Halder. Halder reluctantly has to accept it, and as he begins to study it in depth, he increasingly realizes that it is the best option. When the French campaign ends in a complete triumph, in which in just 40 days the Germans achieve something that was not thought possible, Hitler's prestige soars to the sky. At this point, high-ranking officers like Halder, who had not initially supported the plan, suffer a significant loss of prestige in Hitler's eyes. In the future, they will have to work hard to regain it. In any case, Hitler convinced himself that he was superior to many of his generals, and that, when the time came, the decisions he could make would be much better. As Hitler gained power and confidence in the field of military strategy, he tolerated less the dissenting opinions of his generals and became very aggressive with them at the slightest criticism. This situation led to fewer and fewer generals daring to contradict him. From the end of 1940 until mid-1941, when Operation Barbarossa was taking shape, the authority of the German leader was gaining ground. At first, the reports that arrived about the situation of the German army were very discouraging. To put it briefly, there was a lack of everything. The fuel reserves would barely last for a few weeks of offensive. There was not enough production of tanks to form new panzer divisions or to cover the replacements. There was a shortage of manpower, and military production could not be increased too much. There was also no surplus of food, and difficulties were also foreseen in this regard for the new campaign. To mention one last element, the Luftwaffe was very worn out, and its continued operations in the skies of Great Britain were not going to allow it to arrive at full capacity for the invasion of the Soviet Union. These reports greatly angered Hitler and made him very angry with the generals who presented them to him. In a way, he accused them of not having faith in his country or in his army, or of course in him. It was from this moment on that it became a general custom not to inform Hitler with very hard data about the situation, and many limited themselves to telling him what the German leader wanted to hear. This, in turn, made them continue to have his approval and to be better regarded. Halder, for example, was one of them, since he wanted to recover his prestige lost in the French campaign. When Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union began, there were cases of generals who repeatedly disobeyed orders, as was the case with Guderian. These acts of insubordination had been allowed in previous campaigns as long as the result of the operation ended well, but this was not the case this time. After failing to conquer the Soviet capital, Hitler gave von Brauchitsch a severe reprimand, which, added to the critical situation, caused him to have a heart attack. With the situation like this, Hitler appointed himself commander-in-chief of the German army on December 19, 1941. Here again, an order from Hitler was imposed in a blunt manner, in which any retreat on the Eastern Front was prohibited. Given the critical situation, this decision was correct, and once again, the German leader became convinced that while his generals failed him, he always made the right decisions. For the 1942 campaign, he decided not to make the same mistakes again, and he had greater control from the outset of the military decisions that were taken. This was precisely the reason why he began to appoint a series of generals who he knew would not act on their own and who would obey him with total loyalty, as was the case with Paulus. Already during the first weeks of Operation Blue, Hitler decided to modify it and divide his army in two to achieve his objectives quickly and simultaneously. It was during these months that a series of resignations and dismissals occurred, including those of the commanders-in-chief of German groups A and B, these being von Bock and Wilhelm List. In addition, Halder himself was also dismissed on September 24th. Neither of these men would hold a military position again during the rest of the war. A few weeks later, when the Sixth Army was surrounded in Stalingrad, and with it, the hopes of obtaining victory over the Soviet Union were lost, the information that Hitler received began to be more biased. Basically, he was given information that was based on half-truths, always based on the most optimistic version of the situation. To see this in detail, there is no better example than what happened with the air supply in Stalingrad. Firstly, when Hitler asked if it was possible to supply the Sixth Army using the Air Force, Hans Jesenek, a high-ranking officer in the Luftwaffe, got carried away by the situation and said yes. It was certainly customary to always give positive answers without having studied the subject in depth. When he later studied the subject thoroughly, he wanted to rectify his opinion, but it was too late. as Hermann Göring had already given Hitler his positive assessment. When the troops in Stalingrad began to be supplied by air, Hitler's desk only received information about the amount of supplies sent, which was very different from what the troops finally received in the city. In other words, this report did not take into account either the planes that did not arrive or the material that was mistakenly dropped on the Soviets. With this, we know that the information that Hitler had was totally wrong, and when a young captain who was able to leave Stalingrad made him realize this, the generals of Hitler's council became very angry. From this date, at the beginning of 1943, the situation became increasingly worse for Germany, and there were few generals who dared to report the situation without any kind of embellishment, so the distance between reality and fiction grew ever greater. As a final explanation, we can see it better with the following summary. The German leader did not want people who informed him of how bad everything was in detail and who, in the end, referred to some retreat or a search for negotiation. What he wanted were generals who, despite the critical situation, would tell him that, regardless of reality, they would manage to turn the battle around and that they would end up winning. After the assassination attempt on July 20th, 1944, the situation within the German High Command became even more difficult. The German leader no longer trusted anyone, and any general who presented him with a negative report was accused of being defeatist and lacking faith in victory. In January 1945, Hitler issued Directive No. 68, in which he completely eliminated the freedom of movement of any troop commander. From then on, any action at battalion level could not be ordered without his approval. So, what do you think? Do you think that Hitler's leadership of the German army had an important influence on Germany's defeat?